Alright folks, recently I found a video posted on a channel called Combat Outlook about how you can tell if someone knows any real swordsmanship, which is an interesting topic, and I've got a few things to say about it. And before I start, let me just point out that even though I have some criticisms, I'm not here to stir up any drama or attack anyone personally, and I ask you to do the same, or not do it, I suppose. You know what I mean. In the description it says that this was originally recorded in 2015, so 6 years ago by now. And normally I would urge caution with older content because 6 years is quite a time period. If I look back at something that I said 6 years ago, there's probably quite a few videos that I don't fully agree with anymore, or downright disagree with, or that I would phrase differently now, because as you continue practicing, continue learning, your perspective changes and broadens and all of that. In this case, it says that the points are still valid, so I'm assuming that they probably still agree with this, at least mostly. So,
hello. All right. So
the audio quality is terrible, so I've turned on subtitles, and these are automatic captions, so they will be quite a bit off every now and then, but they might still help understand.
Some quick things to tell whether someone is BSing or not about whether they know something.
Whether someone is BSing or not, so bullshitting. Captions did not get that at all.
There are 4 quick things that I know about that I like to look for whenever someone tells me they know something about swordsmanship. Whether it be,
Okay, so 4 indicators that somebody knows or doesn't know about swordsmanship.
First thing is actually how they handle the sword. I like to look at the amount of respect that they treat any sword-related item that they're handed.
So this is obviously about safety. I don't care if someone does any kind of grand gesture that they've seen in a movie or video on YouTube, whatever. That in and of itself doesn't tell you anything, but what does tell you something is how safe they are being. So do they control the blade? Are they aware of where the blade is? Do they randomly point it at people? Do they just wave it around? And what have you? Are they aware of where it is in relation to their body and others? So one big issue is whenever somebody is walking around with a sword and just kind of points it. Just imagine somebody walking around a corner holding a sword forward, and then somebody else comes around the corner that they don't see, and guess what? Now you've just impaled someone. So that is a huge tell, of course. It may seem a bit ironic because he's holding a Larp sword and that's what they're practicing with, and safety is not really that much of a concern with those. However, it's still good to have a solid habit, because if you handle something like this routinely and just mess around with it, whatever, and then someday you pick up a sharp sword, you may have these bad habits from handling Larp swords. You may just, touch the blade all willy-nilly and wrap your fingers around the edge or whatever, point it, like I already mentioned. And so, yes, it is good to learn proper safety, even with Larp swords.
Another thing, how they hold the sword. Yeah, there are many different grips throughout history, throughout time, about how they would hold a certain weapon for certain scenarios. Technically, there's no wrong answer, but certain weapons need to be held certain ways in order to be used correctly.
Okay, so many different grips for different swords throughout history. That is very correct. There is no general universal answer. How do you grip a sword? Which sword? For example, when you're looking at a side sword or especially a rapier and you see someone just grip it like this, in a hammer grip, they're most likely not trained unless they're using a side sword and they want to emphasize a cut, because you can definitely cut better like this compared to having a finger over the guard. However, even then, it's not really going to be a hammer grip as such. It's more likely going to be some form of handshake grip. So this is more plausible. So this is fine. This would be the more common grip. That's what you generally use with a rapier, because this gives you more point control. It allows you to thrust more effectively. It brings everything more in line, so you don't have to overextend your wrist to do that, which is another thing. I've made an entire video about if you see somebody thrust like this, hyperextend their wrist and thrust like that, that's bad. That's actually going to likely cause wrist injury that can mess with your tendons. So that is objectively wrong. But I've seen some people go to the opposite extreme where they overcorrect and insist that a hammer grip is always wrong. And that is definitely not true. If you look at certain sword designs, like this Ewart Park bronze sword, this is a hammer grip kind of affair. This large pommel here tells you that you're supposed to hold it like that. It fixes your hand into a certain position. You can sort of force it. I mean, with this one, not even really. You can't even really force it. You would have to go so high up on it and, finger the sharp section of the blade that this is not practical. This doesn't make any sense.
They might have skills with using it that way because they practice, but that kind of practice is not correct. It's not the kind of practice that makes using the structure of the sword efficient.
That's a good point. I've said that before as well. Just because somebody has practiced a lot doesn't mean they've done it correctly or efficiently or optimally or whatever. Like, for example, before I personally joined a HEMA school, I did a lot of this myself, trying to figure things out, and we did a lot of sparring without supervision from an experienced instructor, all of that. And there are certain problems with that. I mean, you can build up plenty of bad habits and do things suboptimally and never know it. But because you've done it so long, if you've done it for many years, you think that you're great at it. But biomechanically, you may be very much off, particularly when it comes to things like footwork.
The other thing, whether their back is straight. No matter what stance or what type of swordsmanship they're doing, if their back is not straight, that shows a lack of practice, a lack of attentiveness when they're actually doing stuff.
Well, yes and no. In a lot of cases, that's true. If you look at the general posture with a lot of swords, it's typically upright. But that has a particular reason. That really has more to do with the footwork. And he actually touches on this later in the video. So there are postures that have a forward lean to them. You see that in a number of manuals. There is a hip hinge with different swords, and that serves a very particular purpose. It's a way to extend your reach or get out of harm's way without compromising your structure overall, because your feet are still planted in a particular way. You still have a wide, solid stance. Your feet are not lifting off in ways they shouldn't, and this can be quite useful. With a Dusak, for example. Now you can get additional reach by leaning forward into the cut, and when the opponent counter cuts, you can lean back. And because you're already leaned forward and your opponent is aiming at your head, torso, or arms where they currently are, if you now not only go back to a neutral position, but even lean back, now you've created a lot of space to evade that cut.
What degree of straightness does the back have when they're actually engaging, when they're blocking, or when they're actually attacking at somebody who's attacking?
So what degree of straightness does the back have when they're actually attacking or defending? And again, in a lot of cases, that is true. For a biomechanically efficient attack, generally it should be upright. I've pointed that out before when it comes to leg cuts in particular. If you lean forward and try to reach the opponent's leg and cut low like that, the problem comes if you're actually lifting off with your rear leg, because now you're imbalanced. Your entire balance is completely thrown off. Your structure is compromised. You are very vulnerable to attacks at that point. In case of cuts to the leg, you can do that with a hip hinge. The only problem is that the most common defense against a cut to the leg is stepping back, voiding the leg and striking to the head at the same time. If your head is forward and low in a position that you can't quickly escape from, that is very exposed. So in that situation, you may not want to do that.
And the last thing actually that I like to look at to tell someone knows they're doing swordsmanship is the back foot. No matter what time of part that they do, the back foot should always be controlled. It could, be attacking, then it's like, that's not what you want. No matter what type of attacks you do.
Yes, so that is also generally true. If the rear foot lifts off, again, like I pointed out before, your balance is compromised. In my earlier sparring footage, you see that quite a bit. That was way before I got into proper practice, and there's a lot of that going on. And that's what people often do by default. They try to get as much reach as possible. They overextend themselves and then just kind of hover precariously on one leg without good balance. Plus, if your rear leg lifts off, that also shows that you're not actually pushing off the ground to drive your attack. If you want to strike while bringing as much of your body weight and core strength into it as possible, you want to push off the ground with your rear leg. Of course, it's not supposed to be stapled to the ground. You need to step after all, and your heel can absolutely lift off the ground as long as the ball of your foot is still in contact, and it can lift off a little bit for short periods. This is more about a combination of foot placement and posture. If the rear foot lifts off and you're leaning forward, now you have a problem. So what do I actually disagree with? What do I actually have to criticize? So far I've agreed with everything, right? Well, it's actually in the comments here. Somebody else says posing as Hemo more like. So the response here is, by Combat Outlook, Hemo has no masters of lineage. Essentially, they read old books and treatises, and then members claim to be combat experts. This is something I've seen all too often. If somebody sees this channel here, Combat Outlook, and they see them fight with swords and they see them make statements about how to tell if somebody knows swordsmanship, a lot of people could jump to the conclusion that, oh, you think you're experts. But unless somebody literally says they think they're an expert, or you ask them, do you consider yourself to be an expert? And they answer yes. Unless that's the case, or unless they give very strong signals that they think they're experts, you don't know. And you shouldn't jump to conclusions. And this dismissive comment of, oh, they just read old books and there's no lineage and no living masters. I've heard that before. In fact, I've made a video about this, talking to HEMA instructor Kyle Tolley about that topic specifically. And the people, in short, just very often make the mistake of assuming that a martial art with a lineage is way older than it actually is, and that it's been unchanged the entire time, which is just not true. If you look at a lot of martial arts, or martial arts in general, you often see there is a more recent history to that, and it has gone through changes over time, and it's all during a time period which it wasn't common anymore to fight with swords on the street. Something else ties into that, which is occasionally I see people asking, has he ever been in a real sword fight? And you have to ask yourself, what does this person mean by real sword fight? If they mean full contact sparring with a fully resisting opponent, then yes. If they mean an actual sword fight to the death with sharp swords, nobody has. Like, that's a completely pointless question. In some parts of the world, machete fights can still possibly happen, or happen in more recent times, but you won't find anybody who has fought in a real fight to the death with sharp swords, unless you've been in an actual sword fight in the Middle Ages or Renaissance or earlier, what have you, and survived that, then you cannot claim to have been in a real sword fight. I would like to say real sword combat. Personally, I like to make the distinction between fighting and combat, because there are a number of things that can be called fighting. Larp fighting can be called fighting. Sparring is definitely fighting. There's a number of kinds of fighting that are not quote-unquote for real, in the sense that you're not going to end up maimed or killed, whereas combat, the way I use the term, is higher stakes. That is a quote-unquote real situation where you could be maimed or killed. So it's a little unfortunate that this channel is named combat outlook. Here's another reply. That is what we're not teaching. We're just sharing our outlook. Fair enough. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're just sharing your outlook, maybe you shouldn't dismiss an entire martial art. I find that a little bit strange. I mean, you can still say, well, it's your outlook, it's your opinion, but it's still a little bit odd to dismiss people who practice martial art based on the historical manuscripts, which are written by people who were in real life combat to the death and know a lot about what actually happens. That irks me a little bit. I mean, again, it's your opinion. You can think whatever you want, but that seems a little bit odd. The thing is, a lot of HEMA practitioners will tell you there are limitations in interpreting the manuals because you have to interpret them. You cannot ask the historical masters directly what they meant, but they are recreating the art not just by reading, but by doing. So that's why I find it a little bit strange to do sword fighting with Larp swords. It doesn't even matter if it's Larp or whatever, but doing sword fighting and then dismissing others who are doing sword fighting while also doing research. There's a technique showcase video as well where he does use historical techniques from the manuscripts. This right here is an interpretation of a Zwerchhau or thwart cut. So he clearly does it himself, so I don't really understand where the apparent animosity toward HEMA comes from. So what about the elephant in the room, so to speak? What most people seem to criticize Combat Outlook for is the use of Larp swords. And so this really depends on the intent, what I think about it. If it's people who meet up just to have a fun workout, basically, and quote-unquote mess around with swords, or whatever you want to call it, really, that's fine. If you want to actually learn swordsmanship, then there are definitely some drawbacks of using Larp swords and Larp weapons, specifically axe versus sword. That is axe versus short sword. So this is artificial in a lot of ways. So this Larp axe here weighs nothing, essentially. Compared to a real axe, especially one with such a large head, you wouldn't be able to swing it like this, just period. Plus, the sword wouldn't be able to parry it. This, for example. So he swings. Boom. Now this is out of measure. Even this, in fact, even with the super light Larp axe, this blows through. Just imagine this with a steel axe. This is just, you have no chance, basically, of defending against that. But he also wouldn't be anywhere near as fast. So there's a lot of artifacts in this, a lot of things that would not happen in real life. So now he's holding the axe with one hand. Is he going to swing it with one hand? Yes. That ain't happening. Not with a real axe in real combat. So, plus, of course, there are certain things you cannot do with Larp weapons. There are reasons to use them. Specifically, you don't want to wear a bunch of protective gear because they don't hit as hard, of course. That's the main advantage. Now, I do think personally they should be wearing fencing masks because the way it is, I'm pretty sure they're excluding the head as a target area. Because if you strike somebody hard, even with a Larp weapon in the head, it's probably not great, especially if you hit the eyes, you might still cause damage to the eyes, particularly with a thrust. Like thrusting a Larp sword into someone's face, that can cause injuries, could break nose or knock out teeth, things like that. So I think it's still better to always wear some form of face protection at the very least, so you can be more realistic with it, because this does not translate to swordsmanship in real life, in real combat. There's a lot of flailing, stumbling. They don't really show that much respect or that much concern about the opponent's weapon. And that's kind of the main issues that I see with that. What you're practicing is fighting with Larp weapons. You're not practicing swordsmanship as such. In my opinion, you need at the very least synthetic practice swords to really do it effectively, ideally steel, because steel behaves differently. Now, Larp swords do bind better than synthetics, because they do have some friction, edge on edge specifically, so that can be helpful for practicing binds, but the problem is the mass and the inertia is just completely different, so you can do a lot of things with Larp swords that you can't with steel swords. And here, by the way, is an example of incorrect grip. If you look at this right here, this heavily overextended wrist, that's a problem. The thing is, there is some good form in this. Like this cut to the leg, for example. You know, he is not overextending himself and he recovers from it, so there's nothing wrong with that. This, on the other hand, this is again a latex sword artifact. If you did this, trying to grab a rapier like this, probably is not going to work. You need to first obtain a bind. If the blades are crossed, okay, so you've obtained a bind, your opponent's blade versus your own, now you can grab that because now it's stationary and the opponent can't react to it as well. If you just try to walk up to it and grab it, you're probably going to get a thrust straight through the hand. Yeah, this particularly, that just doesn't work the same way with steel. You know, the way he just immediately whips back up, you know, even though historical swords are by no means slow, they do have a certain amount of mass, and that comes in mainly whenever you're decelerating, stopping, and accelerating again to change direction. If you strike downward, you have to decelerate all that mass to come to a stop, then you have to accelerate it again, which means with a sword, you can't just do this. You know, with a Larp sword, you can. They are so light that they don't add much beyond the weight of your arm. So yeah, with 300, 400 grams or whatever, sure, you can do all this. With a real sword, that doesn't work quite the same way. Even a particularly light one, again, not trying to tell these guys what they can or cannot do or say or what have you. If this is how you want to practice, then by all means, you know, any kind of fun sword activity that is safe has pretty much my stamp of approval. I may not be interested in it myself. I may not do it like that myself, but hey, it's all good. If you're safe, if you're having fun, you know, if you're exercising, whatever, it's all good. But when I hear someone talk about combat and swordsmanship in general while they practice with Larp swords, that does raise a bit of an eyebrow from me. I mean, if you do it in addition, if you also practice with steel, you know, that's a different story. Anyway, I figured this would be a good opportunity to have an open discussion about swordsmanship and how to practice it and this and that and the other. So feel free to let us know your opinions in the comments. By the way, I definitely prefer this over people who do nothing but forms and never spar. If you never try your techniques against a resisting opponent who doesn't put up with what you're trying, then your interpretation of martial arts is going to be quite limited. So obviously I take this over a certain log master any day. Anyway, hope you found it interesting. Let us know what you think, and thanks for watching. Have a good one, folks.